are such a genuine gem. Thank you for clicking on my video. I'm Brooke McKenna, but today's case is solved from arranged marriage to murder. This is the case of Jassi Sidhu. Now, she was a girl with a feisty personality and a plan to be happy. Unfortunately, that plan would never come true because she would never be allowed to go through with it, and it would end in consequences that would change multiple lives. Now, the Fifth Estate followed this case for years, and they have made a few episodes on this case that I will link down below for you because I did get a ton of information from them because it's not widely talked about at all. By the way, it's my absolute passion to tell these stories, and I mean absolutely no harm or disrespect when I do so. So if you would like to support me, then all you have to do is make sure that you are subscribed, give this video a thumbs up, and leave a nice comment down below. Now let's get back to the story. So it was 2000 in India, and the Sidhu family would often go back to India and the Punjab to visit because that is where their mother, the mother of the household, grew up. And so they would often go back there to visit because they had since moved to Canada. Now, they had a 25-year-old daughter named Jaswinder Kaur who went by Jassi, and she had just graduated from high school and had started to go to school to be a beautician. She wanted to work on hair and nails and makeup, and she was such a creative individual, and she had so much passion about her. She was doing this to make money for her family, but she also didn't strive to live a normal life. She wanted something where she could follow her dreams and something that was different than the norm. And she was beautiful, she was kind, she was sweet. Now, Jassi had grown up in a pretty wealthy family, but to her it didn't seem like money was the most important thing. In fact, it didn't really matter to her at all. Jassi seemed like she really knew what she deserved, and she wasn't going to let anyone tell her otherwise. Now, her fierce personality was something that was an act of bravery for the life that she lived. It was June 9th of 2000 in India, and Jassi would be found in a canal, deceased. She had had her throat slit, and nobody knew what had happened. That would be until they would find another man who was unconscious and had been beaten. And it would take him several weeks to actually come back into consciousness. And when he did, he had a story that everyone would be shocked to hear. He said that the day prior to Jassi being found on June 8th, the two of them had been riding on a scooter in a place called Sangwar, and they had been just out riding around when a white car would pull up behind them. And at this point, men started charging at them with sticks and swords and tried to beat them. And Jassi would actually fall off of the scooter, and this man would stop the scooter and run back to her. This man's name was Sukhwinder Singh Sidhu, and he would be known as Me Too around these villages in India. And he would be saying that the reason Jassi fell off the scooter was because he had actually ducked to avoid being hit, and Jassi hadn't realized what he was doing, and she was the one hit instead. And so when she fell, Me Too would run over to her and kind of be hovering over her to protect her while being beaten himself. And the entire time, Jassi was calling for him, saying, "Me too, me too, me too." Me Too was asking these attackers why they were hitting them, and nobody was answering him. They just continued to beat them. And at this point, Jassi started screaming as well, saying, "Don't hurt my Me Too. Don't hurt him." And that is when Me Too would say he lost consciousness, and the next thing he knew, he woke up in the hospital bed with everybody staring at him, waiting for his statement about what had happened. He didn't know that Jassi had then been abducted and was then killed. and nobody would tell him for quite a long time because they feared he wouldn't be able to handle it. You see, Jassi was said to be the love of Me Too's life, but now she was gone, and nobody knew why. The autopsy of Jassi would show that her cause of death was shock and hemorrhage as a result of damage to the vital organs, and it would also be found that she had been sexually assaulted multiple times. And people began to speculate as to what had happened and who was behind this, and to explain to you how they even got to this point of speculation, I'm going to have to take you back to Jassi's past. You see, her family had already moved to Canada by the time she was born on August 4th of 1975, and they would actually wait about a year to register her birth, which was very strange. But, you know, they lived in a normal and safe community. It was of Maple Ridge, and everybody knew who they were. They had moved there back in 1970 to start a blueberry farm, which would be a very successful business. This would earn them actually millions of dollars. The Sidhus would practice the Sikh religion, which from my research was the belief that the humans kind of have a cycle of birth, life, and rebirth, and that what you have done in your previous life would determine how successful you were or what you got in your next life. And it was basically karma moving from one life to the next. So you really had to be careful what you were doing in the previous life, and if you were, you know, the best person you could be to get a good life next time as well. Now, the Sidhus were actually pretty conservative as well, and they would believe that a man would always be in charge of a household no matter what. And unfortunately, because Jassi's father did suffer from schizophrenia, they believed he could no longer be in charge, and so the power went to Jassi's mother's brother, so her uncle, named Surjit Singh Badesha. He would overlook the entire family, make sure everyone was doing okay, and be the one that the children and the women would look to for advice or to ask if they could do anything. Basically, everything had to go through Surjit. Now, the entire Sidhu family lived in these communal living quarters. It was a 9-acre plot of land that they had all pitched in to buy so they could all be around each other. Generations of this family would all live in one place. This home actually had 25 rooms, 19 bathrooms, and 6 kitchens. So obviously different families were living within it, so one kitchen wouldn't suffice. They needed multiple. And they were actually a pretty close-knit community of all these family members that would, you know, work together to keep everyone safe, make sure everyone had money and food, and they would all work together as well, and everyone would need to contribute. This would kind of be to the extreme, and Jassi was never really able to go out with her peers and do any of the normal after-school activities or parties that most teens would go to. And she would go to school, she would do her prayers, she would do her chores, and that was basically the extent of her life. And her friends knew that she had a strict family, and sometimes she would actually show up to things after school, and they would be so surprised and happy and welcoming of her, only to realize that one of her male family members were always there watching her if she was out of the house. And she would often confide in them that she felt like she was always being watched or spied on by the male individuals in her family. Dating was definitely not an option for her at this time. In fact, she couldn't even go anywhere where there would be boys present. And Jassi, of course, was getting very frustrated by this. She didn't want her strict parents to rule over her anymore. She wanted that freedom that all teenagers do, and she was counting down the days till she was 18, just like any other teenager who wants that time away from their family, to realize that freedom doesn't necessarily get them all that they've wanted. But for Jassi, she knew in the back of her mind, even though she was counting down the days till 18, it didn't really mean anything in her family, because being 18 didn't necessarily mean you left the house or you were going to stop being watched by the male superiors of the home. Her family was the kind to stick together all through life, or at least until Jassi would be married. but not just to anyone. Now, she was out of school by this point when she was 18, and she was expected to get a job to provide money to the family to pay for their expenses, and she wanted to be a beautician, so she got a job working at the Peaches and Cream beauty parlor, and everyone there loved her. Her coworkers loved to talk to her. She was just a breath of fresh air. She was more shy, but she was a beautiful soul, and they loved having her around. And so this kind of gave her a little bit of that freedom to be able to go to a job that was her own. However, this didn't mean that she got to do everything she wanted. In fact, her brother would drive her to and from work every single day, meaning that she didn't have a chance to stop off anywhere else or to meet someone or do anything other than go straight from home to work back home again. And at this point, she was earning some money, which could have, gotten her a place of her own or just to do something she loved. However, her uncle would demand that money in its entirety to help out with the family, and Jassi would only be given a portion of that to live on while she was still living at home, because they thought she didn't need a lot of money if she was living inside the house, but they wouldn't let her do anything else. By the time Jassi was 19, it was 1994, and her family would go and visit once again to India, and her mother had grown up in a city called Jagaran, and so that's where they would go to stay, and that December would change everything for Jassi. You see, she'd heard about a famous kabaddi player who was handsome and athletic and was well known around because he would travel around playing kabaddi, and this was actually a form of tag that was a lot harder. It would really take a lot of strength and energy to continue and to win these games, and this boy was very good at it, and so everybody knew him. He was also a rickshaw driver or a taxi driver, as well as a farmer, to actually make some money so he could travel around and do this sport. And she would come face to face with him. While Jassi was there to visit, she would be out kind of shopping around, and that's when she would see this boy from across the room, and he was there buying clothes, and they instantly looked at each other, and they would say it was like love at first sight. It was just this extraordinary kind of fireworks happening within them, and they kind of knew that it was supposed to be them that were together, and they had met for a reason. And they would get on this taxi together, and he would be driving Jassi back to her village, and that is when Jassi would bring out a tissue she had and write a little note, and she would hand it to her friend, who would hand it to this boy's friend, and this note would say her name and where she was from. And that is when this boy would write a heart with an arrow through it back to her on this tissue and get it back to her. And that is when that was it. They were basically fully in love at this point, except they kind of didn't speak, so they didn't really know where each other was living or if they would ever see each other again. And thankfully they did, because Jassi would actually be outside one day and he would walk by and she would hand him another note saying, "I love you." Now, this man or boy, I think that he was 18 at this point, so I guess he was a man at this point, and he would be none other than Me Too. And they wanted to spend every moment possible together, but the only problem was Jassi's family couldn't find out because they wouldn't allow her to be around boys. And so Me Too would begin to sneak into where she was staying with her family, where she had a window in her bedroom. He would go up to this window, he would crouch down so no one could see him, he would put his hand through the window so they could hold hands as they whispered to one another, and this was basically the only amount of communication that they could find where they wouldn't be caught. Now, eventually, they wanted to talk more. Me Too wanted to come in. They wanted to have that physical interaction, of cuddling. That is when Jassi's aunt would actually say that she would help. And she began to put sleeping pills in the food that everybody in the family was eating, so they would be extremely tired and knocked out. And so Mitu would then come in through the window and cuddle, and they could talk for a while the aunt sat outside to make sure no one would come. They would give these family members sleeping pills for 3 weeks so they could see each other, and of course when somebody takes something every single night, they're going to become more tolerant to it, and so the family wasn't as tired anymore and a lot more aware. And that is when one night when Mitu was in the room, they were up whispering all night, and Jassi's mother would walk in to see who she was talking to. This shocked them completely, and Mitu ran. And the next morning, Jassi would tell her mother that she was just dreaming. But it's not known how much her mother really believed this, because a few days later, Mitu would be caught jumping over the fence to get away before somebody caught him, and he would be seen by the uncle, Surjit. Thankfully, though, nobody saw his face, so they didn't know exactly who he was, only that he was a boy running away from Jassi's room. Mitu had been living a life full of restrictions as well from where he lived in India, but Mitu didn't let this stop him from having a good life. He made a life for himself, he made money, he found a hobby, and he was a good person. This still wasn't enough for some people, including Jassi's family, who would look down upon someone like this for not being wealthy and for being simply a taxi driver in India that didn't have any sort of power, and they would not want Jassi and Mitu to be together, and Jassi knew this, and so did Mitu. And so when it came to the point that Jassi was about to go back to Canada, she would go to Mitu crying and sobbing, saying not to forget her and that she didn't want to go back to Canada without him. Her family wouldn't let her stay in India, and she knew that. They had other plans for her, and it was going to be something that would happen pretty quickly after they got back. You see, arranged marriages were quite common for them, and they were going to be setting up these elaborate parties where they would invite the wealthy individuals to come and basically look at Jassi and see her as some sort of prize to be won. From there, her family would choose who she would be with for the rest of her life, and Jassi didn't want this, but she knew that nothing would change their minds, even if she told them about Mitu, and so she didn't tell anyone except for her friends, who she swore to secrecy, saying that basically she would be killed if they found out. Her friends were shocked by this and of course weren't going to say a thing, but they couldn't believe Jassi actually believed her own family would kill her over loving someone. At this point, she was attending all these parties she was supposed to, saying that she did not want to be doing it, writing to Mitu the entire time, saying he needed to hurry because they were eager to marry her off, and she was really being thrown to these men who were wealthy and would look good to be a part of the family, and the number one suitor was a man who was 3 times her age, at 60 years old. Jassi was racking her brain for anything that would get her out of this situation, and she knew what she wanted. She was just afraid she would never get it. Mitu and Jassi were writing letters, they were calling each other often, but they were still getting used to each other's languages, because Jassi knew a little bit of Punjabi, but she didn't know enough, and so they were really struggling because Mitu didn't know English. But Jassi wanted to see him in person, because I think a lot of the times body language can communicate in a way that words cannot, and so they needed that. And that is when she would hatch a plan to go back to see him. It was now 1999, Jassi was 24, and she had officially come up with this plan. She told her mother that she wanted them to pick her a suitor from India to get married to. And she knew it wouldn't be Mitu, but that wasn't her plan. She said that they were going to go back to India as a family, and that is when they were going to line up all of these men, and she would go to these parties and she would be introduced to them. And that's what her family thought she wanted. But in fact, she wanted to see Mitu. And when they arrived, she would immediately sneak away to go see him, and they would hug for the longest time. And they would begin to tell each other that they couldn't live without each other. And, Jassi would say, "Me too, marry me." But that wasn't possible, was it? Well, Jassi would go back to where her family was staying that night, and she would act as though everything was normal, that she was happy, that she was ready to move on with finding her husband. However, she had already found him, and she would tell them she was going to stay with her friend, or may ask them, more likely, if she could stay with a girlfriend who lived in a nearby city that next night. And so, for some reason, they agreed, and they didn't question her. They didn't send anybody with her. So on March 15th, she would go to this nearby city. She would meet up with Me Too, and they would find a drunken Sikh priest who was willing to marry them in secret at a temple. A few of Me Too's family members were there supporting, and they would officially become husband and wife. They would have the honeymoon that night in a hotel where Jassi introduced Me Too to hamburgers and pizza that he had never had before, and that is when Jassi would need to go back the next day to her family, because they were taking her back to Canada, saying she wasn't really interested in any of the Indian men that they were showing her. And so they were taking her back home, and once again she told her friends and not her family, saying that they would not only kill her, but him if her family found out. Jassi was writing and sending money to Me Too, and thankfully no one in her family had found this out yet, and she would hire a lawyer to rush the immigration papers to get Me Too to Canada because she believed he would be safer there. It was about a year and everything seemed to be going smoothly. Everyone was safe, but Jassi and Me Too were itching to see each other, and it had been a year since they had been in contact physically. They were thankful that they were alive, but they still missed each other incredibly. This is when everything would come crashing down, because rumors had started back in the village in India that there was a secret marriage that had happened, and soon everyone knew who it involved. And then the wrong person heard, and they would call Jassi's mother, Malkit, and Malkit would answer the phone to a person in India telling her that her daughter was married already. And Malkit was emotional. She began to scream and cry and flail about, saying that Me Too was dark-skinned, short, and looked like a girl, saying he was not worthy of Jassi. Me Too would never amount to anything, and that she believed he married Jassi just to get to Canada and have her money. And Jassi would find out quickly that her secret was out, because she would be locked in her bedroom without food and water and would be hit repeatedly. Her own mother would admit to hitting her, saying that Jassi was her daughter and she could hit her if she wanted, if she did wrong. At the same time that Jassi was imprisoned in her own home, her uncle Surjit would head back to India to fix the problem he believed that Jassi had created. He believed this was tarnishing the family's reputation, and he would go to the Indian police saying that Jassi and Me Too's marriage was fraudulent, and that she had been kidnapped and held at gunpoint to sign this marriage document, that she did not want to marry him. The police didn't think about questioning Surjit further or, letting Me Too say his side of the story. They went to arrest Me Too, and thankfully he wasn't home. He was out running an errand, but his mom was, and she would be interrogated and screamed at, and was so intimidated by the police. And they also wanted to know where Me Too's friend Bindri was, because he had been at this wedding, and they would find Bindri first. They would interrogate him while beating him with sticks and tying him up, and they were demanding to know where Me Too was, but they had also offered him $16,000. He would deny this because they wanted him to say that the wedding never happened how it did, that Me Too forced Jassi But this wasn't the case. Surjit had offered him that $60,000 right in front of the police, and the police said, yeah, you should probably take that. And he wasn't shocked because this is how it worked apparently. Back in Canada, Jassi was being offered a car and many materialistic things as long as she would get a divorce. But when she refused this, they continued to beat her, and then they took away her passport. They isolated her from the family, from the rest of the world, even more. But that is when her mother would come into her bedroom and say she changed her mind, that she would actually allow Mitu to come to Canada to get to know him, and that, you know, maybe that would change everyone's minds and perspectives of him. So Jassi would sign these papers, these documents to get him over to Canada, and that would be it. She would be absolutely thrilled. This paper was faxed to India, and the police were taken aback because everything Surjit said seemed to be true. Jassi had signed this document saying that she had been kidnapped and forced into marriage. And when Mitu heard about this, he was shocked and he was heartbroken because his love was now saying that he was this monster, that he wasn't. But this document was written in Punjabi. She didn't read Punjabi. She didn't know what it said. But she had trusted her mother because you're supposed to be able to trust your mother. And she had lied to her face. Mitu knew that he had letters, he had documents, he had telephone bills, he had pictures, all proving he knew Jassi and this wasn't a kidnapping. However, if she was saying otherwise, then his fight would never be enough. Mitu would call her as quickly as he could and tell her what exactly she had signed, and she would be furious. She would immediately say she was leaving, and she would need to get to India to be able to dispute these claims and the document she had signed herself. And so she knew this wouldn't be easy, that she would need to escape her home. But once again, she was an extremely smart young lady, and she came up with a plan. She would have her friend call the police saying that there were loud screams and, screams of help coming from the Sidhu family home. And on April 7th, police would show up to see if everything was okay. And Jassi would say it was not. She would grab all of her things that she could, and she would run out the door with this officer, while her own family screamed horrible things at her from behind. The officers in Canada would take her to the police station, where she would call her friend and coworker named Tamara and would ask if she could stay with her for a while because of everything going on. And Tamara said, of course, I will be there to get you. And she picked up Jassi with 2 large garbage bags where she had shoved everything she'd had in there, as well as her beautician supplies she had brought as well. They would head back to Tamara's home for a while where she would be safe. This didn't mean everything was fine though, because she knew that Mitu would still be hunted in India, and she didn't have the money to help him or to get to him. And Jassi told Mitu she didn't want anyone to be in danger because of her, but she knew that Surjit wouldn't stop. So that is when her friends all band together and gave her some money for a plane ride to India. Because she had tried faxing a letter to the India police saying that she had been forced to sign those documents saying it was a kidnapping under false pretenses, and that she was married to Mitu for the right reason, and that she feared for her and Mitu's life on a daily basis. And they heard these statements, but they said, unless you are here, there's really nothing we can do about it. So her friends made sure she could get there. They were scared for her safety, but her family had frozen her bank account with a small amount of money they had allowed her to begin with, but she didn't have anything. Jassi and Mitu would be together once again on May 12th, and they would immediately go to anyone they could saying that they were happily married, they loved each other, and that the problem was that he was not liked by her parents and her maternal uncle, which is why this was such a big problem. And Jassi wouldn't stop there. She wanted the charges completely dropped against Mitu, and she would go to a whole bunch of different lawyers and judges, and the problem was most of them were bribed by people who had more money, meaning her family. But she finally found one, and she would get his charges dropped. Surjit, who was still in India searching for Meetu, was so frustrated and angry when he found out the charges had been dropped. And he would actually find Meetu at this point, walk up to him and say that he had dishonored their whole family and that if he didn't divorce Jassi, that he would basically be killed. And, you know, Meetu was done being scared at this point. He had Jassi next to his side. He saw her strength and he used that. And he looked Surjit right in the eyes and he said, if you want to kill me, if you have the courage to, then do it right now. And Surjit didn't. In fact, at that point, he flew back to Canada. Jassi and Meetu would finally be able to live like a true married couple, and in fact Jassi got to meet Meetu's family, and his mother adored Jassi. She was overprotective of them. She treated her as her own daughter, and there were actually even celebrations for their marriage there. But eventually Meetu's mother said, you know, I love having you guys here, but you're not safe. You need to go to another village to stay with some family members there so I can ensure that you're going to be okay. But unfortunately, they would still be found there and they would be attacked and Jassi would be murdered and found in a canal. She had been taken to a farmhouse, locked up by these killers, and her life had been taken. But we'll get into exactly what happened in a little bit. But back in Meetu's village, his mother was so incredibly heartbroken, not even for the fact that her own son was in the hospital, unconscious, but because the daughter she had just met was now dead. And she had feared this would happen. But how did these killers know where they were? Because they had gone to this other village. Well, somehow Jassi's mom had gotten the phone number for where they were staying and wanted to talk to her. And Jassi was so excited that her mother actually wanted to speak to her that she talked to her. And her mother was saying, you know, I'm going to send you money. Just tell me, you know, where you are, how long you're going to be there. And unfortunately, she already knew where they were. And Jassi would tell her that they would be there for, you know, a few nights. And they didn't realize at the time that she had ulterior motives. After the murder of Jassi, this case blew up in the media. Everybody wanted to know who had done this, why, and so the police were feeling the pressure to solve it, and that meant they were actually doing things, even though, you know, this wasn't necessarily pushed upon them to do anything by anyone with money. They were kind of forced to by the public. At this point, Meetu was finally released from the hospital, but he was still fearing for his life, and he had good reason to, because the day after, a gunman would come to his house and shoot into his home. Thankfully, he wasn't there, but his family was, and they very well could have been hurt. At this point, the police had been doing a search for anything that could be connected to Jassi's murder, and that is when they would come across a farmhouse, and it had a white car inside. In the backseat, there was actually blood-stained clothing, and this car would be registered to an Anil Kumar. They would also find a sword and a shoe thought to belong to Jassi, as well as a rifle that was once again registered to Anil. This would be a huge break in the case because Anil was known to be a part of a huge crime gang in this area, and they rounded up 12 men to be brought in to be questioned, and they would slowly start confessing to Jassi's murder. One of them was even a police investigator, obviously gone rogue. Now the question was, why did they do this? Many of them said that they had been offered $50,000 to kill Jassi, and the phone records would tell investigators so much more, because they would find that there had been a call placed the night of the murder to one of the killer's cell phones. This was tracked back to Canada. That's right. This phone call was to Uncle Surjit himself. But this isn't where the phone calls had started. It wasn't just that night. It was as soon as Jassi had fled to India, when her friends had paid for the ticket. Surjit had been making phone calls frequently to a man named Darshan Singh. And he was an old friend of Surjit who lived in India, and 147 calls have been made between the two of them. Darshan Singh was actually one of the men who was in jail at this point in India who was a part of this crime gang. Jassi's friends back in Canada had no doubt that her family had something to do with this. However, the Canadian police were saying that they had no jurisdiction for a murder that happened in India and they couldn't do anything. However, if the conspiracy to commit murder had happened in Canada, they would have jurisdiction. So why weren't they doing anything? Her own mother said that Jassi was a disgrace and that they could get anything done in India. The most chilling part was that she also said that India was Jassi's death sentence. Now, some people said maybe Darshan and Surjit were just old friends talking. You know, that's obviously a possibility. But 147 calls right before your niece is murdered by that man kind of makes it suspicious. Then police would find that Darshan wasn't the only one Surjit was in contact with. He was actually in contact with 3 of the men they had in custody as killers. There was Joginger Singh, Anil Kumar, and Darshan Singh. And 12 calls had been made the night of the murder. Meanwhile, the Canadian authorities were saying that they did have jurisdiction, that basically they lied about that, but when nothing was being done and they were asked about that, they were told that it was an ongoing investigation and they couldn't speak on it. But it had been 5 years since Jassi had been murdered, and nothing was done. Reporters of the Fifth Estate would go and talk to both Surjit and Jassi's mother, who were still free at this time, and, question them about the case and about what had happened and about the evidence connecting them. And neither of them would ever want to talk. They would just get in their cars, drive away, refuse to say anything. And it was found that it had been 5 years since Jassi had been murdered, but none of her family had gone to collect her body, even though they went there often. But they didn't go to get her. Over in India, Meetu was living a heartbroken life, but his friends were determined to keep him safe. They would walk him anywhere with guns, and they would just make sure that no one was going to ambush him, and he would often sleep on the roof in case another gunman came in the middle of the night. And he said at this point his only reason for living was to get justice for Jassi, and that he wanted to see the people who had done this punished. But the problem was, he still didn't have a ton of money, and no one would listen to him. He was still getting threats. He was being offered money to keep quiet about the whole thing, and he was saying no, that his love cannot be bought, that he loved her far more than money, standing up for what he believed in would come at a cost. And on August of 2004, he would be thrown in jail for the sexual assault of a local woman in India who would say that he had done this horrible act to her, and he was in jail and he was saying he didn't do it, that he believed this was the Sidhus trying to make him seem like a bad person and doing this to him. Meetu said that they either can kill him or he'll continue to fight. And he was also still wearing his wedding ring, and it had been so many years later. Now, it was also found that the woman who pressed the charges against Meetu worked for none other than Darshan Singh. And he was currently out on bail awaiting the trial for Jassi's murder, and he would be interviewed and he would say, no, I think Meetu is responsible for the sexual assault and it was all just business. I'm not sure what that means. 7 of the gang members would be convicted of the killing in 2005. However, 3 would be overturned, and Darshan was thought to be the one who arranged the murder on behalf of the family, and they were all sentenced to life in prison. Now remember that, because that will come into question in a little bit. Now, Meetu had also been in jail for the last 4 years on the sexual assault charges, and there would actually be a campaign to test his DNA 4 years later, and it was now 2009, when he would be released because it wasn't a match. And the woman who pressed the charges would confess that she had done it because she'd been paid by Darshan to do so. Meetu's life had been one judgment after another based on how he looked, how much money he had, but his heart was always in it for the right reasons, and he was always such a good person that it had so much done to him. No one cared what kind of a good man he was or how much he loved Jassi and she loved him. It was just that they didn't believe he was good enough, and he was punished time and time again for this. But he said he would have endured all of this to still be with Jassi, and in fact he hopes they will meet again in another life. Now this isn't where it ends, because Darshan Singh, who was sentenced to life in prison, would be found to be living in Canada, where Jassi had lived, by 2009. The Fifth Estate had gotten a tip saying that he was out of jail, and they contacted the jail and they said, yeah, there was a Supreme Court order in India that would release him. And nobody knew where he currently was. It was said he was in India, but no one could find him there. There was a witness that would come forward saying that Darshan had told him he hadn't just murdered Jassi for money, but to cement basically a relationship with a business partner in Canada. And it was found that this huge house that the Sidhus had bought had two different names as the owners. One being Surjit's son, and the other was Darshan's daughter. Yet again providing a connection between these two individuals. Darshan would get permanent residency in Canada in 2008, but because he had lied about his criminal history, it was revoked and he had to go back to India. Now, Uncle Surjit was also found to get legal advice right after Jassi was murdered on whether he could be extradited back to India, and the lawyer said, there's probably not a likely chance of this happening. And so Surjit felt very happy about this. But thankfully that would be wrong. This would all change in 2012, and on January 6th, Surjit and Jassi's mother, Malkit, would be arrested in Canada 12 years after Jassi's murder. There would be a hearing in 2013 on whether they should be extradited to India, and one of Jassi's friends would come forward testifying that she was forced to sign the papers saying that the marriage was a fraudulent one, and that she had often said she was scared of her own family. A year later, on May 9th, 2014, they would be all set to be extradited, with the judge saying it is the Canadian court's role to determine whether a jury could convict based on the evidence, not whether they should convict. The next year, the Supreme Court of India would acquit Darshan, who was now living in India, of all charges of Jassi's murder, saying that they were giving him the benefit of the doubt and that there was no evidence against him, none saying that he had committed murder, and that it was all just for a media trial. At this point, Malkit and Surjit had not yet been extradited because their case had been appealed twice, but thankfully on January 24th of 2019, they would officially be taken to India, and they would land in Delhi, and they would be seen the next day with bags over their heads, walking in handcuffs. Me Too was relieved that the case was finally getting somewhere and Jassi was going to get her justice, and a police leader over there even said about Me Too has had to face a lot. This is a very sad case. There are no words to describe this case. Imagine if you had to undergo something like this. From what I have found, Malkit and Surjit are still awaiting their trial in India, and many fear that they will be acquitted as well. However, a witness has come forward, and it's actually a man that confessed to the murder of Jassi, that said he was there that night that Jassi was killed, and he was talking to Surjit on the phone. And he had said that Surjit had told him that he would pay more if he would kill the girl, meaning Jassi. And the killer said that Jassi was pleading for her life, asking to talk to her uncle or her mother or anyone, and Surjit said okay, and handed the phone to Jassi's mother so Jassi and Malkit could talk. And Jassi would basically be saying, I will do anything. I will come home. I will be perfect. I will not disobey you. I will do whatever you want. Just please have mercy on me. And her mom simply said, kill her. Don't leave her. Now, this is what is unfortunately thought to be an honor killing. And it's unfortunately something that I think happens far more than we even know about, because it's so covered up And this is when there is a murder of a family member because they have been thought to bring dishonor on the family or brought shame upon them. It's said that it happens way more often to women and girls than it does to men because, the men are thought to be able to do much more without that punishment. And it's also said to not necessarily be a part of the Sikh religion, that it's more of the culture and these certain families that feel this way, and it's not necessarily because they're following this religion that's making them do so. Reasons that an honor killing can happen, that a family can say that their family member should be murdered, is, if they want a divorce, even if it's to an abusive husband, if they refuse an arranged marriage, if they are a victim of sexual assault, as if they are the reason for it, which is never the case, or if they have sex before marriage, if they are dressing in inappropriate clothing, if they're not acting appropriately, or if they are not practicing their faith. These can all be reasons family can say that they don't deserve to live. Basically, when these women and girls show that they have flaws, that they're, not perfect, that they have a different life path, that they speak up for what they want, that's not allowed. And that's not okay. Unfortunately, if women who, like Jassi, are brave enough to stand up for what they believe in, if they do something that the families don't want, they know that they're risking their life for that. And Jassi knew well what she was doing, and that didn't stop her from doing it, but that doesn't mean she should be punished for doing something she knew was going to get her in trouble, because there's no reason she should have been in trouble for that. Me Too longs for a time when he gets to be with Jassi again, and he says that he often imagines what their life could have been with kids, a family, a beautiful life, and how different it would have been from Jassi's family. And, she used to tell him that she would die for him, that she didn't want to live without him, and unfortunately that came true. Me Too said that they were each other's first loves, and he would have done anything for her, but that now his hope for a life filled with love and happiness has diminished, that he wanted it with her, no one else. It seems to me that nowadays Me Too's life is filled with survival, something he knows well, something that he's had to do all his life, and the only time he didn't feel like he had to, even though they were still fighting, was when he was with Jassi. They really seemed to just be that comfort, that peace that the other needed. And now he doesn't feel that anymore. Jassi was a strong woman who was determined to have a life of her own that she wanted, that she chose, and why was her life taken for that? How in any way is that okay? And why is this still happening to anybody anywhere? It's a privilege that many of us don't even realize we have. And it's horrific to think that this could happen to anybody else. And, a lot of these cases, we can say that, this is probably just a fluke incident. But for this one, it definitely isn't. And I think precautions need to be put in place for these family members to be able to get out and get help when they are feeling fearful of their own lives when it comes to their family members. I really hope that I did Jassi's story justice, and that for Me Too, I hope that this story spreads and that she does get justice, that her killers aren't just acquitted because they are rich and because they are powerful. Don't ever forget to speak up. Your voice is powerful enough, and I love you to absolute pieces. Okay? Bye.